Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to which places and at what times of the day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1842. Louisiana's plantation country sprawled along the mighty Mississippi, a landscape of vast wealth built upon human suffering. Among the countless souls forced to toil under the brutal plantation system was a man who would become the central figure in a tale that has largely been forgotten by history, a skilled musician whose talent would ultimately lead to one of the most chilling acts of quiet rebellion the South had ever witnessed. The humid air hung heavy over Willow Creek Plantation, located in St. James Parish, approximately 40 miles upriver from New Orleans. The estate was owned by the Harrington family, who had established their fortune through sugar production, joining the ranks of the wealthiest planters in the region. Their Greek Revival mansion stood as a monument to their prosperity, featuring massive columns that formed a deep porch and second-floor gallery on all sides, much like the other grand homes that dotted the Mississippi's banks. Behind this facade of Southern refinement, however, operated a system of extraordinary brutality. Jonathan Harrington, the plantation's master, was known throughout the parish as a man of refined taste and severe temperament. At 46 years of age, he had inherited the plantation from his father some 20 years prior and had nearly tripled its size and value. His wife, Margaret, 15 years his junior, was a delicate woman from a prominent Charleston family. Known for her beauty and her passion for music, the Harringtons maintained a carefully cultivated image of gentility that masked the cruelty that sustained their way of life. The couple had 3 children: Thomas, their eldest son at 20 years old, Elizabeth, 18, and James, just 12. The family occupied the highest echelon of Louisiana society, hosting lavish parties attended by the region's elite. These gatherings were famous not only for their extravagance, but also for the exceptional musical performances that Margaret insisted upon providing for her guests. It was this love of music that would inadvertently set in motion the events that would ultimately lead to the family's downfall. Among the 173 enslaved people at Willow Creek was a man named Isaiah Miller. According to parish records, Isaiah had been purchased by Jonathan Harrington in 1834 from a plantation in Virginia. The bill of sale, preserved in the parish courthouse archives, described him simply as a Negro man of about 25 years, sound in body and mind, with exceptional skill upon the violin. What the document failed to capture was Isaiah's extraordinary musical gift, a talent that would ultimately shape his fate in ways no one could have predicted. Isaiah Miller was born into slavery around 1810, though the exact date of his birth was never recorded. According to accounts compiled by a journalist who investigated the case in 1868, Isaiah had been taught to play the violin by his previous master's son, who recognized the young slave's natural aptitude for music. When financial hardship forced the Virginia plantation owner to sell some of his human property, Isaiah's musical ability made him a particularly valuable asset, commanding a price nearly double that of other enslaved men his age. When Isaiah arrived at Willow Creek, Margaret Harrington quickly became aware of his remarkable talent. Within weeks, he was removed from field labor and assigned to the household, where his primary duty became providing music for the family and their guests. For Margaret, who had been educated in the finest European musical traditions during her years at a Charleston finishing school, Isaiah's playing was a revelation. Though self-taught in many respects, his ability to learn complex compositions after hearing them only once or twice astonished her. A diary entry from Margaret, dated October 12, 1835, recovered decades later from a trunk in the plantation's attic, provides insight into her fascination with Isaiah's abilities. The slave Isaiah performed Mozart's violin sonata in E minor this evening with such skill that I found myself quite moved. There is something in his playing that transcends mere technical proficiency, a soulfulness that I have rarely encountered even among the most celebrated performers I have heard in Charleston or New Orleans. It is almost unsettling to think that such artistry could exist in one who is, by law and custom, considered property rather than a man. This uncomfortable recognition of Isaiah's humanity through his art created a complex relationship between musician and mistress. Margaret began to provide Isaiah with sheet music and even arranged for him to receive additional instruction from a French violinist who occasionally visited from New Orleans. These privileges, however, did not extend to freedom from the brutal realities of slavery. When not performing, Isaiah was still subject to the plantation's harsh discipline and lived in the same squalid conditions as the other enslaved people. The contradictions of Isaiah's existence at Willow Creek were noted by Frederick Carson, a northern journalist who later wrote about the case in the Atlantic Monthly. Here was a man whose soul could soar to the heights of artistic expression, yet who was denied the most basic human dignities. In the evening, he might move the plantation mistress to tears with his rendition of a Beethoven sonata, only to be whipped the following morning for some perceived infraction of the plantation's countless rules. The psychological torment of such an existence is nearly impossible for the free mind to comprehend. Indeed, as parish records later revealed, Isaiah experienced the same punishments meted out to other slaves at Willow Creek. The plantation's punishment ledger, maintained by the overseer William Thornton, includes multiple entries concerning Isaiah, including notations of whippings for insolence, failing to complete assigned duties, and unauthorized absence from quarters. One particularly disturbing entry from 1837 reads, "Negro Isaiah received 20 lashes for being found with a book of poetry not authorized by Master Harrington. Slave claims it was given to him by Mistress Margaret, but this is deemed unlikely." The conflict between Isaiah's artistic gifts and his status as property created tensions not only within himself, but within the Harrington household as well. Jonathan Harrington, while proud of the prestige Isaiah's performances brought to his plantation, was increasingly concerned about his wife's apparent attachment to the enslaved musician. Several accounts from household servants, recorded after the events that would later unfold, suggested that Jonathan had grown jealous of the time Margaret spent with Isaiah during music lessons and rehearsals. This tension came to a head in the winter of 1841, when Jonathan returned unexpectedly from a business trip to New Orleans to find Margaret and Isaiah alone in the music room, poring over a new piece of sheet music. According to Eliza Johnson, a house servant whose testimony was recorded in the subsequent investigation, Jonathan flew into a rage, striking Isaiah across the face and ordering him to the stables to be whipped. Margaret's pleas that they had been doing nothing improper fell on deaf ears. The overseer's ledger for that day records simply, "Negro Isaiah received 50 lashes by master's direct order." What it doesn't record is the devastating impact this punishment had on the musician's hands. The severe whipping left Isaiah with permanent scars and damaged tendons in his left hand, threatening his ability to play with his former skill. For a man whose entire identity had become entwined with his music, this represented a loss even more profound than the physical pain. In the months that followed, Isaiah struggled to regain his former dexterity. Margaret, racked with guilt over her role in his punishment, convinced Jonathan to allow Isaiah time to heal and practice rather than being reassigned to field labor. Jonathan agreed, but with the stipulation that Isaiah would now perform only at his explicit instruction and never alone with Margaret. During this period, a subtle change came over Isaiah that few noticed at the time, but many would recall later. The household staff observed that his once expressive face became increasingly impassive, his eyes vacant except when he played his violin. Even then, The passionate engagement that had once characterized his performance was replaced by a mechanical precision. He spoke only when directly addressed and spent his free hours alone, practicing obsessively to overcome the limitations of his injured hand. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that behind this mask of submission, Isaiah was nurturing a plan. The nature of this plan would only become clear in the spring of 1842, when Jonathan Harrington announced his intention to host the most elaborate celebration in Willow Creek's history to mark his 25th year as the plantation's master. The event was to take place on April 18th, 1842, and preparations began weeks in advance. The guest list included over 100 of Louisiana's most prominent families, politicians from as far away as Washington, D.C., and even several European dignitaries who happened to be touring the American South. No expense was spared. Exotic foods were imported from New Orleans. The mansion was decorated with thousands of fresh flowers, and a dance floor was constructed on the lawn beneath a canopy of oak trees draped with lanterns. Central to Jonathan's plans was a musical program that would showcase his plantation's cultural refinement. Margaret was tasked with organizing the performances, and despite Jonathan's lingering suspicions, Isaiah was to be the centerpiece. He would perform several classical pieces for the assembled guests, accompanied by a quartet of musicians hired from New Orleans, and would later play dance music as the evening progressed. In the weeks leading up to the celebration, Isaiah seemed to emerge from his withdrawn state. He engaged more with the household staff and even smiled occasionally, leading many to believe that he had finally adjusted to his circumstances. Margaret noted in her diary that his playing had regained much of its former brilliance, though she also observed that there is something different in his music now, a quality I cannot quite name, but that seems to speak of distant places and profound longing. What Margaret did not know was that Isaiah had been working on an original composition. In the pre-dawn hours, when the plantation was silent, he would practice this new piece in the stables where he was unlikely to be heard. According to later testimony from Daniel Lewis, another enslaved man who became a key witness, Isaiah called this composition his freedom song, though he would not explain its significance even to those he trusted. As the day of the celebration arrived, Willow Creek Plantation was transformed. Carriages began arriving in the early afternoon, bringing guests resplendent in their finery. The women wore elaborate gowns, imported from Paris, their necks and wrists glittering with jewels, while the men dressed in formal attire that belied the heat of the Louisiana spring. By contrast, the enslaved staff wore the clean but simple uniforms Jonathan Harrington had ordered specifically for the occasion, a performance of gentility that masked the brutal reality of plantation life. The early part of the evening proceeded according to plan. The guests dined on a lavish meal served on the Harringtons' finest china, with wine selected from Jonathan's extensive cellar. As twilight fell, the formal musical program began with performances by the New Orleans musicians, playing pieces by Mozart and Haydn that demonstrated the Harringtons' sophisticated taste. When it came time for Isaiah to perform, a hush fell over the gathering. He appeared wearing a dark jacket that had once belonged to Jonathan's father and had been altered for such performances, another costume in the elaborate charade of plantation gentility. Those who witnessed his entrance later described a strange intensity in his demeanor, a focused energy that seemed at odds with his usual careful subservience. Isaiah began with the programmed pieces, performing Vivaldi and Bach with technical perfection. The guests applauded politely, though some were heard to express astonishment that a mere slave could master such complex compositions. Margaret Harrington watched with evident pride, while Jonathan stood nearby, accepting congratulations for his extraordinarily talented property, as if Isaiah's gift were somehow of his own making. As the formal program concluded, Jonathan stepped forward to make a speech thanking his guests for joining in the celebration of his quarter century as master of Willow Creek. He spoke of his family's legacy, the plantation's prosperity, and his hopes for its future under his son Thomas's eventual stewardship. Throughout this address, Isaiah stood silently in the background, violin in hand, waiting to begin the dance music that would continue into the night. What happened next was reconstructed from dozens of witness accounts, parish records, and a subsequent investigation by authorities. As Jonathan concluded his speech to enthusiastic applause, he turned to Isaiah and instructed him to begin playing for the dancing. Instead, Isaiah stepped forward, positioned himself at the center of the raised platform that had been constructed for the musicians, and began to play something entirely unexpected. The composition that flowed from Isaiah's violin that night was like nothing the assembled guests had ever heard. It began softly, almost tentatively, with a melody that seemed to draw from African rhythms and European classical traditions in equal measure. Several witnesses later described it as hypnotic and unsettling, noting that conversations throughout the gathering gradually ceased as everyone turned to listen. As the piece progressed, it grew in complexity and emotional intensity. Some listeners later claimed that they could hear in the music a narrative, beginning with sorrow and despair, then building to a controlled rage that was all the more powerful for its restraint. Margaret Harrington, with her musical training, was perhaps the first to recognize that Isaiah was not playing from memory or sheet music, but was creating something entirely original and profoundly personal. Jonathan, initially confused by the deviation from the planned program, quickly became angry. According to multiple accounts, he approached the platform and ordered Isaiah to stop and begin the dance music as instructed. Isaiah appeared not to hear him, his eyes closed in concentration as the music continued to build. When Jonathan reached out to grab his arm, Isaiah simply stepped back without interrupting his playing. What happened next would be debated for years afterward. Some claimed that Jonathan attempted to strike Isaiah, while others insisted that he merely reached for the violin. All agreed, however, that Isaiah continued playing with an almost supernatural focus, his damaged left hand flying over the fingerboard with a dexterity that seemed impossible given his injury. The music reached a crescendo of such emotional power that several guests later described feeling physically affected by it. Some reported shortness of breath, others a sensation of pressure in their chests. Margaret Harrington, according to her lady's maid, became visibly distressed, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. At the height of this musical frenzy, Jonathan Harrington suddenly clutched at his chest and collapsed. In the confusion that followed, few noticed that Isaiah continued to play, his composition transitioning to a quieter, almost peaceful conclusion as Jonathan lay dying of what would later be determined to be a massive heart failure. The parish physician, Dr. Samuel Wells, who was among the guests, attempted to revive Jonathan, but quickly pronounced him dead. In the chaos of the moment, Isaiah finally lowered his violin and stood silently amid the panicked crowd. According to multiple witnesses, his expression remained eerily calm, almost detached from the scene unfolding around him. It was Thomas Harrington, the eldest son and now sudden master of Willow Creek, who first voiced the suspicion that would soon grip the entire plantation. "He has killed my father with that devil's music," he reportedly shouted, pointing at Isaiah. "Seize him." The accusation seemed absurd to many of the guests. How could music, however unusual, cause a man's death? Yet in the heightened emotions of the moment, and given the deep-seated fears that always simmered beneath the surface of plantation society, the idea took hold. Isaiah was seized by several male guests and the plantation's overseers, then locked in a storeroom to await the parish sheriff. When Sheriff James Beaumont arrived the following morning, he found the plantation in turmoil. Margaret Harrington had been sedated by Dr. Wells after becoming hysterical. The guests had departed in shocked disarray, and rumors were spreading among both the white and enslaved communities about what had truly happened. The sheriff's initial investigation, documented in records still preserved in the St. James Parish Courthouse, reveals the difficulty he faced in making sense of the events. The official cause of Jonathan Harrington's death was recorded as failure of the heart, with no evidence of poison or other tangible methods of murder. Yet Thomas Harrington and many others remained convinced that Isaiah had somehow caused the death through his music. Isaiah himself refused to speak when questioned, responding neither to threats nor to promises of leniency if he would explain his actions. This silence was interpreted by many as an admission of guilt. The only words he was reported to have uttered came when Thomas Harrington visited him in confinement and demanded to know why he had killed his father. According to the overseer who was present, Isaiah replied simply, "I played his truth back to him." This cryptic statement only fueled the growing conviction that Isaiah had indeed committed some form of murder, though by means that no one could quite articulate or understand. In the absence of clear evidence, superstition filled the void. Rumors spread that Isaiah had learned voodoo music from a Haitian slave who had briefly lived at Willow Creek years earlier. Others suggested that he had made a pact with the devil to imbue his playing with deadly power. The legal authorities found themselves in a difficult position. There was no law against playing music that upset someone, even if that person subsequently died of natural causes. Yet the pressure to punish Isaiah was intense, coming not only from the Harrington family, but from plantation owners throughout the parish who feared the implications of allowing an enslaved person to be perceived as having killed his master without consequences. After 2 weeks of confinement and interrogation, Isaiah was formally charged with causing the death of Jonathan Harrington through means unknown but malicious. The unusual charge reflected the unprecedented nature of the case and the authorities' determination to make an example of him despite the lack of conventional evidence. The trial, held in the St. James Parish Courthouse in June of 1842, became a sensation that drew observers from across Louisiana and even from neighboring states. The proceedings, recorded in meticulous detail by the court clerk, offer a fascinating glimpse into the legal and social tensions of the antebellum South. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Henry Garrison, called numerous witnesses from among the party guests, all of whom testified to the strange and powerful nature of Isaiah's music and Jonathan's collapse immediately following it. Dr. Wells testified that while Jonathan had shown no previous signs of heart trouble, the intense emotion caused by Isaiah's unexpected and provocative performance could have triggered the fatal attack in a man of his age and temperament. Most damning was the testimony of William Thornton, the plantation overseer, who claimed that he had overheard Isaiah practicing his death music in the weeks leading up to the celebration and had warned him to stop. There was something unnatural about it, Thornton testified, something that didn't belong in Christian music. When I told him to play something proper, he just smiled in a way that chilled my blood. The defense, such as it was, consisted of a court-appointed attorney named James Lawrence, who had little experience and less enthusiasm for defending an enslaved person accused of killing a prominent planter. His primary argument was simply that it was impossible for music alone to cause death, regardless of its character. If unusual or foreign music could kill, he argued, then half the composers in Europe would be charged with murder. Isaiah himself remained silent throughout the proceedings, neither confirming nor denying the charges against him. This silence, interpreted by the prosecution as defiance and by some observers as dignity, ultimately served to seal his fate. Without his testimony to counter the narrative that had formed around the events, the jury took less than an hour to find him guilty. The sentence, delivered by Judge William Crawford on June 24, 1842, was death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for July 2nd, allowing time for any appeals or petitions for clemency, though none were expected given the circumstances. What happened next was documented not in the official records, but in personal correspondence and newspaper accounts that only came to light years later. Margaret Harrington, who had been largely secluded since her husband's death, emerged from her grief long enough to visit Isaiah in his cell 2 days before his scheduled execution. The meeting, observed by the parish sheriff, lasted less than 30 minutes, but would later be the subject of much speculation. According to Sheriff Beaumont's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1859, Margaret asked Isaiah directly if he had intended to kill her husband with his music. Isaiah's response, as recorded by Beaumont, was, "I played what was already there, Mrs. Harrington. The death was in him long before I drew my bow." Margaret reportedly left the jail in tears and immediately began drafting a petition for clemency, arguing that Isaiah had not intended to cause Jonathan's death, and that executing him would be a grave injustice. She gathered signatures from several prominent citizens who had known Isaiah and appreciated his musical gifts, including the French violinist, who had provided him with additional instruction years earlier. The petition, preserved in the state archives in Baton Rouge, arrived on Governor André Roman's desk on July 1st, 1842, just 1 day before the scheduled execution. Whether due to the petition's merit or political considerations, the Harrington family had connections that extended to the state government. The governor issued a stay of execution pending further review of the case. This temporary reprieve would ultimately extend into a commutation of Isaiah's sentence from death to life imprisonment. The official reasoning, as stated in the governor's order, was uncertainty regarding the mechanism of death and the intent of the accused. Isaiah was transferred to the state penitentiary in Baton Rouge, where prison records indicate he was assigned to the prison workshop manufacturing shoes. The story might have ended there, with Isaiah spending the remainder of his life in prison, gradually forgotten by all except those who had witnessed the strange events at Willow Creek. However, an unexpected postscript was added in 1852, a decade after the original incident. Margaret Harrington, who had never remarried after Jonathan's death and had gradually withdrawn from society, died of tuberculosis in February of that year. Among her personal effects was found a sealed letter addressed to Governor Joseph Walker, with instructions that it be delivered after her death. The contents of this letter, now housed in the Louisiana Historical Society archives, shed new light on the events of 1842. In the letter, Margaret confessed that Jonathan Harrington had suffered from a heart condition for several years before his death, a fact that had been carefully concealed from everyone outside the immediate family. "My husband's physician in New Orleans had warned that any strong emotion or exertion might prove fatal," she wrote. "Jonathan insisted that this weakness remain secret, fearing it would undermine his authority on the plantation and his standing in society." More significantly, Margaret revealed that she had specifically requested that Isaiah create an original composition for the anniversary celebration, a request she had kept secret from Jonathan. "I asked him to play something that expressed his true feelings," the letter stated. "I believed that an honest artistic expression would move our guests, and perhaps even soften Jonathan's increasingly harsh treatment of those he owned. I never imagined the power of what Isaiah would create, nor its effect on a heart already weakened by disease and cruelty." Whether Margaret's posthumous confession was motivated by guilt, a desire to clear Isaiah's name, or simply a need to unburden herself before death, its effect was immediate. Governor Walker ordered a review of the case, and in March of 1852, Isaiah Miller was pardoned and released from prison. The historical record regarding Isaiah's life after his release is fragmentary. A Freedmen's Bureau document from 1866 lists an Isaiah Miller, formerly enslaved, approximately 55 years of age, profession violinist, among those seeking assistance in New Orleans following the Civil War. A subsequent notation indicates that he was employed to teach music at a school established for the children of freed slaves. The final documented reference to Isaiah appears in the journal of a northern missionary who worked with freed people in New Orleans during Reconstruction. An entry dated October 1869 mentions attending a concert where an elderly colored man named Miller, who is said to have once been imprisoned for killing a plantation owner with his violin music, performed with exceptional skill despite visibly damaged hands. His playing brought many in the audience to tears, though whether from the beauty of the music or the story behind the musician, I cannot say. The true nature of what occurred at Willow Creek Plantation on that April night in 1842 remains a subject of debate among historians. Was Isaiah Miller's composition truly intended to induce a fatal heart attack in Jonathan Harrington? Did he somehow understand, through observation or intuition, the plantation owner's hidden physical weakness? Or was it simply a coincidence, a powerful artistic expression that happened to coincide with a natural death? What is clear is that Isaiah's death march represented something unprecedented, a form of resistance that utilized art rather than violence, yet proved equally deadly. In a society that sought to deny enslaved people their humanity and creative expression, Isaiah's composition became a weapon more powerful than any conventional tool of rebellion. The Harrington family never recovered from the scandal and tragedy. Thomas Harrington, unable to manage the plantation effectively, sold Willow Creek in 1848 and relocated to Texas. The property changed hands several times before being largely destroyed during the Civil War. Today, only the foundations of the main house and a few crumbling outbuildings remain, gradually being reclaimed by the Louisiana wilderness. Yet the story of Isaiah Miller and his deadly composition persisted in local oral tradition, passed down through generations of both black and white families in St. James Parish. Over time, it transformed from historical incident to legend, with various embellishments and supernatural elements added to explain what many still found inexplicable: how music alone could kill. In 1962, exactly 120 years after the events at Willow Creek, a researcher from Tulane University named Dr. Robert Jenkins began collecting these oral histories as part of a broader study of resistance within the slave system. His work, published in the Journal of Southern History in 1964, brought academic attention to the case for the first time and initiated efforts to separate fact from folklore. The most compelling evidence uncovered by Jenkins came from the descendants of Daniel Lewis, the enslaved man who had witnessed Isaiah practicing his composition in secret. According to family stories passed down through 5 generations, Isaiah had studied not only European classical music, but had secretly preserved musical traditions from Africa that had been brought to Louisiana by earlier generations of enslaved people. These traditions included not only rhythmic and melodic elements, but also beliefs about music's power to affect the physical and spiritual world. In some West African cultures, specific combinations of rhythms and tones were believed to be capable of inducing trances, healing sickness, or even causing harm to enemies. Isaiah, according to this family tradition, had combined these ancestral techniques with his classical training to create something unprecedented, music specifically designed to affect the human heart. Whether one accepts this explanation or views Jonathan Harrington's death as simply a tragic coincidence, the case of the enslaved musician who played his master's death march remains one of the most unusual acts of resistance in the history of American slavery. Unlike the violent uprisings that periodically erupted throughout the South, Isaiah's rebellion left no physical evidence, required no conspirators, and could never be conclusively proven, even as its deadly outcome was witnessed by over 100 people, Perhaps most significantly, it represented a form of resistance that the slave system was wholly unprepared to counter. Resistance through art and creative expression. In a society that sought to reduce human beings to property, denying their intellectual and emotional complexity, Isaiah Miller's deadly composition demonstrated the impossible contradictions at the heart of the slave system. How could people be both property and artists, both instruments of labor and creators of beauty, both bodies to be controlled and minds capable of extraordinary innovation? The sound of Isaiah's violin has long since faded into history, the notes of his fatal composition never recorded or preserved. Yet the echo of what happened at Willow Creek Plantation continues to resonate, a reminder of the power of art to express truths that cannot be silenced even in the most oppressive circumstances. As dawn broke over New Orleans on that October morning in 1869, those who had attended the elderly violinist's final public performance departed in silence, each carrying away a piece of a story that defied simple explanation. Some said that when Isaiah Miller played his final note, a single tear rolled down his weathered cheek, whether from grief, vindication, or simply the release of emotions carried for decades, no one could say. What remains certain is that in the space between enslaved musician and plantation master, between artistic expression and deadly intent, between music and mortality, lies a story that challenges our understanding of power, resistance, and the profound human capacity for both creation and destruction. The Death March played at Willow Creek continues to echo across time, a haunting reminder that in the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to speak its truth, sometimes with devastating consequences. The story of Isaiah Miller has been pieced together through fragments of history, courthouse records, personal diaries, newspaper accounts, and oral histories passed down through generations. Yet much remains unknown, lost to time or deliberately obscured by those who found the truth too uncomfortable to preserve. What we do know suggests a narrative far more complex than a simple tale of murder or supernatural revenge. In 1865, a journalist named Edward Harrison traveled to Louisiana to document the changing social landscape in the aftermath of the Civil War. During his time in New Orleans, he encountered an elderly black musician performing on Royal Street, whose damaged left hand caught his attention. When Harrison inquired about the injury, he was told a story that led him to spend the next 3 years investigating the events at Willow Creek Plantation. Harrison's unpublished manuscript, discovered among his papers after his death in 1872, provides one of the most detailed accounts of the aftermath of Isaiah's release from prison. According to Harrison, Isaiah had been taken in by a community of free people of color in New Orleans, many of whom were accomplished musicians themselves. There, he found not only refuge, but recognition of his extraordinary talent. The man I met bore little resemblance to the vengeful figure described in plantation legends, Harrison wrote. Rather, I found a dignified, soft-spoken individual whose passion for music had survived decades of unspeakable hardship. When I asked him directly about the composition that had allegedly killed Jonathan Harrington, he smiled faintly and said, "Music cannot kill, sir. It can only reveal what is already there." Harrison's manuscript includes transcripts of several interviews with Isaiah conducted in the years before the musician's death. In these conversations, Isaiah finally broke his decades-long silence about what had happened that night in 1842. His account challenges many of the assumptions that had calcified around the incident in both white and black communities. "I did not set out to harm Mr. Harrington," Isaiah told Harrison. "What I composed was not a death march, but a freedom song. It contained everything I had been forbidden to express throughout my life: the sorrow of separation from my family in Virginia, the humiliation of being treated as property, the rage at seeing others beaten for the slightest infractions, and beneath it all, the unquenchable longing for liberty. According to Isaiah, the composition had indeed been carefully planned, but not as an assassination. Rather, it was conceived as an act of artistic truth-telling, perhaps the only form of honest communication possible between enslaved and enslaver. "Mrs. Harrington asked me to play something from my heart," he explained. "I do not think she understood what that truly meant. How could she? She had never lived a day without the freedom to speak her mind." The question of whether Isaiah knew about Jonathan Harrington's heart condition remains unanswered in Harrison's account. Isaiah neither confirmed nor denied knowledge of the plantation owner's physical weakness. If Mr. Harrington's heart failed him upon hearing the truth of his own cruelty played back to him, Isaiah said, "that is between him and his Maker. I merely held up a mirror in the only way I knew how." Perhaps the most revealing passage in Harrison's manuscript concerns a visit he made with Isaiah to the ruins of Willow Creek Plantation in 1868. The once grand estate had been burned during the war, its fields left untended and its slave quarters abandoned. Standing amid the crumbling foundation of the main house, Isaiah reportedly took out a violin, not the same instrument he had played decades earlier, but one given to him by a French musician who had recognized his talent in New Orleans. "He began to play as the sun was setting," Harrison wrote. "The composition was unlike anything I had ever heard, neither fully European nor entirely African in its influences, but something uniquely American, born from the collision of these traditions. There was sorrow in it, certainly, but also triumph, and most surprisingly, something that sounded like forgiveness." When he finished, I asked if this was the same piece he had played on the night of Harrington's death. He shook his head and said, "That music belonged to bondage. This belongs to freedom." The musical traditions that Isaiah Miller helped to preserve would go on to influence multiple generations of musicians in New Orleans and beyond. The unique fusion of African rhythms with European harmonic structures that characterized his playing became one of the foundational elements of early jazz, though his direct contribution has been largely overlooked by music historians. A rare exception is found in the work of Professor James Williams of Fisk University, who in 1948 published an article titled "Forgotten Ancestors of American Music," in which he traced the lineage of certain jazz techniques to musicians who had been active in New Orleans during the Reconstruction era. Williams identified Isaiah Miller as a critical missing link between the plantation music of the antebellum period and the sophisticated urban styles that would later emerge in the city's vibrant musical scene. Williams's research uncovered several musicians who claimed to have studied with Isaiah in his final years, including Joseph Reynolds, who would go on to become one of the first black band leaders to record in the early 20th century. In an interview conducted in 1945, when Reynolds was in his 90s, he recalled Isaiah as a man who could make the violin speak in tongues unknown to most white folks. He taught us that music wasn't just notes on a page, but a language of the soul. And he showed us how to say things with that language that couldn't be said out loud in those days. The historical record regarding Isaiah's death is as ambiguous as much of his life. No death certificate has been found, and accounts differ as to when and where he died. According to Harrison's manuscript, Isaiah passed away peacefully in his sleep in February of 1870 in a small room above a French Quarter bakery where he had lived for several years. He was approximately 60 years old. Other sources, however, suggest he may have lived several years longer. A notice in the weekly Louisiana, a newspaper serving the black community of New Orleans, dated September 1873, mentions the death of the renowned violinist Isaiah Miller, whose extraordinary life journey took him from the chains of slavery to the concert stages of our city. If accurate, this would indicate that Isaiah survived to witness more of the promise and ultimate betrayal of Reconstruction than previously believed. What is certain is that no grave marker has ever been found bearing his name. Like so many formerly enslaved people of his generation, Isaiah Miller's final resting place remains unknown, his physical presence erased from the landscape, even as his legacy continued to resonate through the music he influenced. In 1896, a folklore collector named Martha Richardson traveled through St. James Parish, gathering stories about plantation life before the Civil War. Among the tales she recorded was one told by elderly residents about the slave who played the devil's music and caused his master to drop dead during a grand celebration. In this version, heavily influenced by half a century of oral transmission and the racial anxieties of the Jim Crow era, Isaiah was portrayed as having made a supernatural pact